Hello, my name is Maribel Gonzalez, and I will be talking about why it's important to scaffold over differentiation in the K-12 classroom. You can find me on Twitter as Mari La Chicana or on Instagram as Decolonize Literacy. I'm really excited to be here and sharing with you during the summer 2021 Pair Fair. And I'd like to introduce myself. I identify as an Indigenous Chicana. I'm a daughter of Mexican immigrants. I'm a mother of two, and I'm a STEM integration transformation coach for Technology Access Foundation in Seattle, Washington. I'm also on the Antiracist Arts Education Task Force for Seattle Public Schools. I write lesson plans and curriculum, and I also facilitate workshops around decolonizing instruction. So again, I'm really excited to be here and explaining why it's really important that we are scaffolding content in the classrooms rather than differentiation, which is a form of institutional racism. In this session, I'm going to be sharing with you all the differences between scaffolding and differentiation. We're going to discuss the definitions and what that looks like in a classroom. We will also be uncovering why differentiation reinforces institutional racism, and of course explaining what that is and how it shows up in our classrooms and school hallways. Additionally, we are going to see some examples of scaffolding that empowers learners to reach their goals. So what is scaffolding? According to Rebecca Alber for Edutopia, scaffolding is breaking up the learning into chunks and providing a tool or structure with each chunk. Here I have an example of apple slices. I have two toddlers, and I know that if I give Demishkali, my 2-year-old, a whole apple, then she'll take a bite or two, and then she'll just leave the apple somewhere for me to find later. But if I give her some slices, then she's more likely to finish the apples. So what I've done is I've been responsive to her needs and realizing that she would prefer smaller, more accessible bites rather than me giving her the whole apple. This is different than differentiation because differentiation hinders growth and it hinders learning, because under that approach, I would be taking the apple away from her, right? Instead of meeting her where she is, right? Based on my experience, based on my relationship with my daughter, I would just say, okay, you obviously can't have an apple because you take a couple of bites and then just leave it. So we're not gonna let you have an apple anymore. So differentiation is a punitive approach. It's also based on assumptions and it's based on segregation. Whereas scaffolding is responsive, it honors the child where they are at developmentally, intellectually, right? And it gives them the benefit of the doubt. So that way, they have access and equitable access to the learning that all students are receiving. Differentiation, according to Rebecca Alber for Edutopia, here is an example where you might give a child an entirely different piece of text to read, or you completely shorten it, or you alter it, you modify it, right? So you're truly giving the child who needs the differentiation a different assignment without their consent. And so differentiation is typically for students who have an IEP. It's typically for students who are considered, who are part of the special education program, who are considered emerging multilingual or English language learner. And systemically and institutionally, that is what or who differentiation is for. So going back to my apple example, we would be taking away the apple and instead giving them something that they can chew, and right, that's better suited for them. And so this is inequitable, and ultimately it's not fair, and it really like creates unintentionally or even intentionally in lots of spaces, barriers to growth. So when I think about differentiation, I think this is a hot topic in schools. We're always trying to meet students where they're at. And I know that every teacher and every administrator and every person at the school district level wants every child to succeed. But without having a critical racial equity analysis on the design and approaches of K-12, then we will be reinforcing racism. So here are some questions that I invite you all to reflect on. How do school districts expect you to differentiate? Right? You have the agency and autonomy to do your research, to connect with your community and network of educators, to figure out the best way to differentiate. But take a moment to think about the expectations from your leaders. How does it show up in your lesson plan templates? What are some of the examples they give you for differentiation? And then also think about, how does institutional racism contribute to tracking in schools? Tracking as in advanced learners, gifted and talented, highly capable. We're also talking about a special education program and English language learning programs, right? So how does institutional racism contribute to this kind of segregated learning in schools? Also think about, how does differentiation create lowered expectations for Black and Brown youth specifically, and for students with an IEP or are emerging multilingual? So I invite you, to think about the answers to this question, especially as we continue the conversation about how differentiation is a form of institutional racism. Reflection is a crucial and integral part of teaching. And as you facilitate and deliver lessons and scaffold and differentiate, I encourage you to answer these questions and reflect on past and future lessons. What is institutional racism? This is the racial inequity within institutions and systems of power, such as schools, employment, government agencies, and social services. This is not the same as racism that individuals have. This takes the form of unfair policies and practices, discriminatory treatment, and inequitable opportunities and outcomes. There is decades of research that have documented that students of color, particularly Black and African American children, are disproportionately classified by schools as having disabilities. Think about how you define disruption. Think about how you define success and its correlation and connection to proximity to whiteness. Think about your English language learners or emerging multilingual learners and the assumptions that you hold when students who are not white express themselves in their authentic way and how you perceive that. If you are a white teacher or even a Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian teacher, think about the biases that you hold on students who are racially and ethnically different from each other. So institutional racism is our schools, and it is our responsibility as educators to analyze, unpack, and disrupt and rebuild our classroom spaces so that every learner has the opportunity to receive equitable access to the same opportunities as everyone else. So these are some assumptions that teachers make about emerging multilingual students that hinder growth. I share these assumptions because typically differentiation is reserved for students who are labeled as an English language learner or students who have an IEP, and even students who have been identified as an advanced learner. All of this tracking and all of these labels come with it a set of assumptions that are reinforced by racism that occurs at the institutional and systemic level. Some of these examples include if you read the roster and you can't pronounce their name, that they must struggle with the English language. Therefore, they are not smart. Therefore, they're going to need a lot of help. They're going to need a lot of structure, and you have quite a year ahead of you. Another assumption is that all emerging multilingual students have the same deficiencies or lack of understanding of the English language, that they are lazy, obstinate, or unintelligent because they're not raising their hand in class, they speak in another language to peers, or they don't complete their work. Many times the assumptions we make is when they're not completing their work, it's because they don't want to or that they don't care about education. And that is an assumption when really it is our responsibility as educators to make learning accessible, to make learning exciting and engaging for youth. It is not the student's job to participate if they don't want to. You have to help them, encourage them, make it accessible, scaffold the materials so that way it increases in complexity and they're able to reach the goals that they create for themselves. So differentiation is an approach that is grounded in punitive culture and also in deficit thinking. Another assumption is that teaching language is a sole responsibility of the ESL department. So segregated learning is not an equitable approach to education. And students who speak another language that's not English have a wealth of knowledge and culture and experiences that make them incredibly capable and intelligent. And that is how we have to approach our instruction, is with that belief in mind and that belief in action. And so giving the students the benefit of the doubt that they have knowledge and they're learning, right, in your classroom and at home and in their communities. And it is our responsibility to make education accessible. So we are going to use scaffolding rather than differentiation is how we can combat institutional racism and these assumptions that we make, right? And additionally, some assumptions that are made is that ELL students or emerging multilingual students, Black students, Brown students, need remedial courses before they can participate in grade level material. That is the magic of scaffolding, is you can co-create an objective or a driving question or an essential question that everyone can get behind in the class. You can introduce it, you can talk about it and help define the terms, the words. And then as the expert teacher, right, like you have your toolkit and your toolbox of strategies, protocols, and structures available, then you can meet students where they're at in order to meet the goal of answering that essential question or understanding that theme at the end of the unit. So if we're thinking about challenging institutional racism, we want to collaborate with students in the classroom. We want to be transparent about instructional decisions that we are making. We want to combat deficit thinking because we know that that contributes to institutional violence in schools and beyond. And we want to stand behind our belief in action that all students can learn by providing personalized structure for equitable learning experiences, and that is what scaffolding is. Tracking is a way for racism to persist in many, many school districts across the country. In Seattle Public Schools in 2019, the highly capable cohort served 9% of white students and 7% of Asian students in grades 1st through 8th, and just 1% of Black students and 3% of Latina students in elementary and middle school are in the program. So considering Seattle has some very racially and ethnically diverse schools, if you were to just look at a classroom, you can tell if it's a classroom for advanced learners or not. So differentiation is an approach that is supposed to serve and support the labels that are given to students. And a lot of the tracking and a lot of this labeling is racially motivated, right? And contributes to white supremacy culture in schools. If you are not approaching K-12 practices with an anti-racist lens, right, it is racist. So we are contributing to racist culture and racist systems when we are not addressing it, when we are not dismantling it or combating it. The Department of Education has branded tracking, designating students for separate educational paths based on their academic performance as a modern-day form of segregation. To be considered an advanced learner, in addition to multiple tests, it requires recommendations from the teacher. In education, teachers are overwhelmingly white women, right? So if we are not combating, analyzing, dismantling the way racism shows up in schools, then we are reinforcing racism, period. Additionally, this speaks to white-centered and white-dominated traditional learning environments that privilege white wealthy students. And so in this system of tracking, students who are wealthy and white are more likely to do well. And there are students of color who succeed and do well, but there is a subtracting that takes place of our identity, right? So we know that in this system, if we are proximate to whiteness, if we learn English, for example, and speak it well, and conform to expectations that are white-centered and white-dominated, then we will succeed in these spaces as people of color. And so it is Dr. Bettina Love calls that spirit murdering, right? It's subtractive. And this is also subtractive schooling is a term that's coined by Dr. Angela Valenzuela from UT Austin. This contributes to lowered expectations. It also contributes to inequitable access for Black and Brown students, right? There's a lot more labor and a lot more work that we have to do as students of color in order to succeed or be perceived as successful in these spaces. Differentiation is a form of institutional racism because it is based on this tracking. And so look back to your lesson plan templates provided by your school districts. There is usually a section that asks about scaffolding. There's also a section that asks about differentiation, and it actually names, students with an IEP, students who are identified as English language learner. This is systemic. It's asking you to think about how you can modify, alter your lesson in order to meet your English language learner, right? In your lesson, what accommodations or modifications are you providing for these students? There's even some school districts that identify low performing. How are you going to meet them, right? And typically what is accepted as responses is to give them completely different assignments. An example of differentiation is, giving advanced learners 0 homework, and the students who have an IEP, who are low performing, give them homework because they need extra help, right? Another example of harmful differentiation is when you give students with an IEP or English language learners, emerging multilingual students, or students who are just struggling, you give them shortened assignments. So instead of 10 questions, you're giving them 3. So think about how this is actually helping students, right? Scaffolding, if you're giving them the 10-question assignment, is you can give them manipulatives, you can make it relevant to their experiences, make connections to their personal lives. You can demonstrate by offering visuals, and differentiation is really, it's really just unhelpful, right? Giving them 2 questions while everyone else works on 10, and then you walk away and they have to work on these problems by themselves is not really helping them, right? No wonder it takes them the same amount of time that some students can take in for the 10 questions. So scaffolding is an inclusive way. It's really centering on learning and not the product, right? Differentiation is very product driven. It's very grade driven. It's very complete your work driven, rather than focusing on learning as a process and learning as a journey. So in our classroom, if we are differentiating, really asking yourself, am I creating a love of learning here in my classroom space? Or am I just checking a box? Because of institutional racism, differentiation is segregated learning. So why is scaffolding better than differentiation? Differentiation is a teacher move that depends on inauthentic assessments. When I say inauthentic assessments, I'm talking about state mandated tests, right? These are inauthentic assessments. These are multiple choice questions that are not relevant to their lives, that lives on a computer. Nobody's ever going to see these responses. These results of these tests are very punitive. They determine whether you go into an advanced learning course or not. It determines your placement in English language learning programs and your placement in SPED programs. Authentic assessments have a purpose beyond that punitive result. So an example of an authentic assessment is students working on a project to end houselessness in their community, and they are creating a report with data to present to their city council members. And so this is an authentic assessment because it has real purpose, and students are motivated to complete because they have a real life audience that they're presenting to, rather than sitting at their desk for 4 hours working on a test that will then just live in a computer. So differentiation, again, is a teacher move that depends on these inauthentic assessments, and they're very punitive in nature, and they reinforce racism in classrooms because of tracking systems and because of internalized institutional racism that contributes to who gets identified as a SPED student. And there are assumptions and biases that teachers have around students who are learning English and who speak multiple languages. And so in order to combat this institutional racism that shows up in our classrooms, we really have to critically analyze with an anti-racist and decolonial lens. And scaffolding is a wonderful solution, and it's a structured form of encouragement in learning spaces where you are collaborating with students to create powerful connections between different topics while increasing complexity. So scaffolding is a really powerful way to not only getting consent from students about what you're learning, but you are working with them and having them think about their own experiences and what they bring to the table to come up with solutions or to understand the content using multidisciplinary approaches. And so using a project-based learning approach is a really fantastic way of scaffolding in the classroom, because you're centering learning around answering a driving question or an essential question, and focusing on how you can get students understanding that. Scaffolding provides an opportunity for every child to meet learning goals that they consent to, because you're being transparent with them about what the objective is or what the goal is, while differentiation unintentionally creates barriers to growth. It is problematic that we are completely altering or modifying assignments and taking away the apple from them, taking away those learning opportunities. And we should be scaffolding content more often in our classrooms because of institutional racism. Here are some examples of scaffolding that empower learners to take accountability for their learning. And as a teacher, you are facilitating support by offering structured, comprehensive support as they are grappling with these complex topics. Some examples include one-on-one coaching. You can use this same visual thinking protocol such as See, Think, Wonder, but use a series of inquiry-based questions that increase in complexity. So what that means is we're using a visual thinking strategy that you love, right? Like pick any one. And in order to get students practiced on this one strategy, you can use it several times a week. But it is, as you are using it, it's to address the same standard or answer the driving question or understanding the theme, but it varies in complexity as you move throughout the week. So by the end of the week, they are grappling and have an answer or an understanding to that standard or an answer to the driving question. And so you can start with a visual, you can start with some vocabulary, front-loading some vocabulary to get them on the same page. Then you increase the complexity by incorporating a word problem or a complex text that they're analyzing with some critical questions. So you're using the same visual thinking protocol, but helping them along. You can have them collaborate in stations using graphic organizers, math manipulatives. For complex word problems, you can include visuals paired with complex text. One of my favorite protocols that I like to use for scaffolding is the in to out protocol. And so the in to out, you have for the in, you are having them reflect independently on a question. You can have them look at a comic. You can have them look at a visual, and they spend some time with themselves. And then for the two, they work with the partner, and you can increase the complexity in that question. And then in the out, they're sharing, it's a whole group discussion with the entire class. So for each section of the protocol, the in to out, you can use different material, different text, visuals, music, videos, and it's all around, it's all addressing the same standard, the same driving question, essential question, or the theme, right? And this is in one class period or two. You can offer a menu of options that all students can choose from that range in complexity. Some harmful examples of differentiation I've seen is only giving certain assignments to advanced learners, some assignments to students with an IEP and English language learners. In scaffolding, you provide a menu of options where students can choose the level of challenge and rigor that they would like to consent to. So if students feel inspired to challenge themselves, they can. And if they choose a challenging activity, then they know they can ask for help, right? And there's going to be support for them. And of course, modeling, not just the teacher, but students modeling is a really powerful way to scaffold in a classroom. An example activity is the fishbowl activity, where you have students in the inner circle modeling for students in the outer circle, and then you switch, right? And so students can see it in action from their peers rather than just the teacher at the very beginning, which is also a really important way to scaffold. Another example of scaffolding is connecting learning to lived experiences, right? Bringing your experiences to the conversation, and you can model that by talking about your own personal experiences. This is really important in creating really inclusive spaces, especially in homogeneously white spaces, as well as racially and ethnically diverse classroom spaces. If you're a white teacher, I encourage you to talk about yourself, talk about your cultural experiences with food. What were you like as a student learning in a classroom? and invite students to share about their own personal experiences as well, and connect that to the standard that you're learning, to the lesson that you are delivering and launching in your classroom. Make learning relevant and to their lived experiences, because students come in with such a valuable wealth of knowledge, and students really should be doing the work in the classroom. Students should be talking, students should be working with others, collaborating with others, doing the research, and working while the teacher is facilitating and just providing support to students who need it. And the last one is reflection is so crucial. Reflection at every opportunity in the classroom, right? Many times teachers run out of time and they cancel this part of the lesson, right? We don't have time for the reflection, we're not going to do it, when actually it allows for multiple interpretations of content, right? You're saying there is not one rigid answer to a problem, that your contribution, your thoughts, your reflection is so important. And it actually helps retain knowledge and memory of what you talked about when you're able to reflect on it. So not only is this helpful in centering student voice, right? Because we want to hear what you're thinking, right? Not only reflection about what you learned, but reflection on the process. What was the process like for you? This really helps create learning fun and inspiring, because it's not centered on the product or the grade. It's centered on the process. Learning is a process, and that's what school is all about. We're helping you love learning so you can be lifelong learners. Thank you so much for listening and reflecting alongside with me about how institutional racism shows up. And I'm really honored to be here, and really honored to be in this shared space, this shared virtual space. I know that we're all invested in the success of our students, and all of us here are interested in growing and becoming more inclusive educators. I really commend you on that, and I look forward to connecting with you on my social media, and you can also email me if you'd like to connect further. I hope you have a restorative summer and have a strong start to the upcoming school year. Best of luck to you.